From the wonderful world of Disney, one day on Beetle Rock.
In the mysterious moment of half-light before the dawn, a full moon cast a ghostly glow over the range. Then the bold sun peaked above the distant summit, announcing the coming of another day. Slowly the curtain of night withdrew. And at last, the ancient meeting ground emerged from the shadows. Almost bone white in the clear morning light, it stood out like a giant rib of the mountains, a skeletal part of the Sierra Nevada. This was the place known as Beetle Rock, the scene of our story, and the stage on which nature's drama would be enacted. Hidden away in this high country were to be found Earth's oldest and largest living things. Trees as tall as the sky itself, trees as old as the Bible, California's giant sequoias. Like the pillars of some pagan temple, they reached towards the heavens. These noble redwoods were survivors of a bygone age, and to these patriarchs a century was but a passing phase, a year a passing moment, and a single day but a tick of time's clock. Yet a day was the time limit of our story. Within that span of hours, between sunrise and sunset, much could happen to change the lives of man and beast, as we're about to see. First to appear on the rock was a solitary buck, testing the morning air. In the shadows were the members of his herd, the does and fawns and younger bucks that had accepted his authority. At this season, the younger bucks grew restless and began to sharpen their antlers. The herd buck knew that someday one among them would challenge his leadership. Well, let them when they would. The young bucks could take the time to sharpen their weapons as they wished. The more frivolous among them could indulge in mock battles as they chose, practice for something more serious later. Important things to consider. Such things as the mountain lion, that most dangerous of enemies. For the last 3 years, there'd been no prowling cougar on Beetle Rock. The great cat had hunted elsewhere, and life for the deer had been relatively calm. But now the mountain lion was back, and the lives of all the deer tribe were in jeopardy. From this moment on, the days of the herd buck would be spent in eternal vigilance. Within the hour, 2 other newcomers had invaded these parts. 2 hunters from the broad flatlands of the San Joaquin Valley, some 50 miles distant. These nosy and energetic strangers were a pair of wandering coyotes. They were somewhat far afield from their normal haunts, yet the presence of small game here had brought them all that distance. noses told them there was prey around, tracks and trails led everywhere, and they went to work with a kind of frenzied enthusiasm. As the coyotes worked their way up the slopes, it became apparent they weren't doing too well. As speedsters, their performance was amazing. As endurance runners, their talent for covering ground was astonishing. But as hunters, they seemed to lack something. When they reached Beetle Rock itself, their chances grew even slimmer. For among all these cracks and crannies, only stealth would work. Never the bold frontal attack. This was a time for the meek and mild to stay safely hidden. And so far as the coyotes could tell, the nearby meadows seemed utterly empty. Beetle Rock, it so happened, lay within the boundaries of a national park, and its denizens long since had learned to accept the presence of people in their midst. For the human visitors, meanwhile, the attractions here were many. Massive rocks that became a gateway to adventure, scenic vistas, bracing air, and of course, the great trees, the major source of wonder in Sequoia National Park. Within a stone's throw of Beetle Rock, there stood cabins with people living in them. Visitors and vacationers come to renew the simple life. Like most of us, however, these had rather forgotten how to look at nature, and so they were not aware that Beetle Rock lay practically at their doorstep, and they had not eyes to see the drama occurring there. On yet another part of the rock, the cougar's two kittens ventured forth to see a bit of the world on their own. As mountain climbers, they weren't exactly at their best. Perhaps it was their age, for they were at that clumsy stage where they were all feet and legs and nothing was quite coordinated. And they still indulge in the habit of kittenhood. Their best entertainment came from the games they invented to play together, wrestling and catch-as-catch-can. They never seemed to tire of this. As hunters, these kittens weren't the menace their mother was. Not yet, anyway. And it was curiosity that took them abroad more than hunger. The marmot, however, was not about to trust himself to their company. The only thing was, he hadn't counted on their quickness, and they were upon him almost before he knew it. Like all cats, the kittens were intrigued with anything that moved. Here was a kind of pine cone that made the game more fun. It tended to fight back. The marmot of course, was merely protecting himself as best he could. And with 2 against 1, the odds weren't exactly in his favor. Still, the tiniest of nature's creatures will put up a desperate battle to live, and the little fellow was holding his own rather well. Now the cougar youngsters found a new kind of game, a sort of follow-the-leader contest called stepping stones. And it was succeeded by one called walk the plank. But suddenly wading didn't seem so much fun, and one of these youngsters displayed a cat's natural distaste for getting his feet wet. As might be expected, this gave the practical joker of the two an idea. A good ducking would soon take care of that kind of squeamishness. It was the bold one who was always the leader in mischief. And he seemed to feel that once you got accustomed to wetness, you shouldn't mind it at all. Soon, he had found a new outlet for his energies. A whole new game, with a whole new set of rules opened up right under his nose. And now the playfulness took on new meaning. It was teaching him to be a hunter. Meanwhile, some other hunters came on the scene, still no more successful than before. Their frantic travels had brought them at last to a watering place for a moment's pause, and more important, a cooling drink. The coyotes had spent the entire morning running and roving and catching nothing. And suddenly, here before their eyes, was someone doing what they didn't seem able to do. So that's how you did it. Well, if it was easy as all that, the coyotes would try it too. Try as he might, the poor coyote couldn't seem to get the hang of it. Finally, he gave it up as a bad job. Obviously, fishing just wasn't his forte. Beetle Rock was lizard land. Here, miniature dragons took the sun. Some of them almost jewel-like objects of natural beauty. But in nature's realm, beauty came in somber tones, too. Even black could seem colorful. When the tarantula took his morning constitutional, it meant putting his best-dressed foot forward in sequence, all 8 of them in proper rotation. problem was, which was which? At times on Beetle Rock, beauty would crop up in quite unexpected forms. This gaudy fellow was out for his morning round, too. The mountain king snake was so brilliantly colored as to seem at a disadvantage in the age-old game of pursuit and capture. What sharp eye could miss this traveling rainbow? It would take a bit of negligence not to notice him. The king snake had chosen a poor terrain for his hunting, and on this day he would not fare too well. Along toward noon of that day, the human visitors decided on lunch out of doors. To these cooped-up city dwellers, the chance to rough it and taste the scent of pines and fresh air was too good to pass up. And so an elaborate picnic was arranged. It had everything from pickles to popsicles. Picnicking of whatever sort is part of the fun of a national park, and now the tiny chipmunk was having one of his own. In no time, the humans had an extra guest at their table, a friendly little fellow and a bold forager. Suddenly, a great commotion began overhead. A noisy raven seemed to be saying he should be in on the picnic too. But soon, he had worn out his welcome. And so it was decided he must be silenced. Like most of us, these folks had rather lost the knack of going to nature. Yet they could readily enjoy the experience when nature came to them. And now, to their delight, another member of the Beetle Rock community arrived on the scene. The innocence of the young in nature accepts the presence of humans sometimes in a way that the adult animal might not. The herd bug, for his part, watched all this with certain misgivings. Back at the picnic ground, meanwhile, some more guests had arrived. The outspoken raven was quick to stake out his claim and seize the bonanza as his own. The little golden-mantled ground squirrel chose to stand on squatter's rights and move in wherever temptation took him. The dapper gray squirrel ignored the argument as beneath his dignity. He figured it was smarter to get the goodies while the getting was good and never mind the squabbling. Besides, one never knew when the rightful owners might return and take it all back. Sure enough, here they came. At this point, the father took charge. He seemed to feel that this was getting a little too close to nature. After lunch, the two boys set out on a journey dear to the heart of all would-be cowboys, a ride on a real horse. Their trip took them toward timberline, up into the high country where they could see things. Strangely, when it came to seeing nature and the life on Beetle Rock, they saw little. They missed the marmot basking in the sun, and they overlooked the badger's den entirely. The wily badger saw them, to be sure, but they never saw him. And so it was that the boys missed out on some of the most exciting events of the day. At the moment, the badger was busy renovating his front porch. A digging animal by habit, he spent much of his time in this dusty diversion. When the hungry coyotes came on the situation, they made some quick calculations that were to prove embarrassing. Thinking the badger to be preoccupied with his chores, they felt they could take him off guard. They soon learned that no coyote in his right mind ever tangles with a badger. Pound for pound, probably the toughest fighter in nature. This was the way of Beetle Rock. The laws of survival were the laws of fang and claw and sharp talon. And the red-tailed hawk was a predator to be reckoned with. There was little that went on in these parts that missed his piercing eye. He, too, had noticed the badger's preoccupation, and he was about to make his bid in this game. Enough of that. In the end, the hawk decided to pick on someone more nearly his own size. In this case, the hapless king snake. When the hawk stuck to his proper role as raider from the sky, his strategy was practically unbeatable. Now the reptile had little defense to offer. Thus it was that on any given day on Beetle Rock, there were the lucky and the unlucky. Later that afternoon, the people of the Beetle Rock cabin were busy being tourists. And in Sequoia National Park, every true tourist must be able to return home and say he saw General Sherman. And if possible, pose for a picture to prove it. Climbing the narrow trail to the top of Morro Rock was on their list too. From here, they could get an impressive panoramic view of the distant Sierra Nevadas. Here was grandeur on a vast scale. Like most tourists, these saw only the scenery, and generally overlooked the tiny creatures whose stories were unfolding all around them. One of these was this little fellow with the oversized tail. He was the pack rat, an inquisitive rodent given to the curious habit of trading in useless objects. Often these objects belonged to humans, and an unguarded cabin seemed to become an irresistible lure for him and his kind. Still, he was not one to profit without honor, and he always tried to give value for value received, generally something equally useless. That way, everybody came out even. Once inside the cabin, his roving eye sized up the possibilities. Here was a whole treasure chest of stealables. One slightly used pine cone for one second-hand ladies' compact. A fair bargain all around. Once in possession, the pack rat hurried home to his storehouse of stolen goods. And a moment later, the badger was headed for the same place. The situation was tense, but the pack rat kept his powder dry. And for this once, crime did pay. This seemed not to be the badger's day. Jumped by coyotes, pestered by hawks, and foiled by the pack rat. Even when prey was offered on a platter, as it were, he couldn't bring himself to trust his luck. The tiny deer mice, it seemed, were out for thrills. They had chosen an odd mode of travel, it's true, but one that would carry them far. These little fellows were rather pushing their luck, and there was no telling where the day's events would take them. The river journey was but the first of the wild experiences that would befall the tiny mice that day. They were active little creatures, and for their diminutive size, amazingly bold. Now the venturesome pair had found new territory to explore, and new perils to risk. Oops. Now they made a beeline for the grocery department, and all those delicacies mice delight in and don't normally find in the wild. Things like sunflower seeds and interesting cereals, and foodstuffs such as a deer mouse never heard of. Bullseye. Who, me? Well, what do you know? time had switched from food to fun. There were so many intriguing things to investigate and objects to climb over, and so many interesting places in which to hide. When it comes to outright curiosity, there's probably no creature to match a mouse. The small boys in this household had obviously built this wheel for a captive chipmunk or a squirrel. Little did they know how adept two mice could be at this same form of exercise. To these timid little creatures, this was not a toy at all, but a cubbyhole to hide in. A mouse is naturally secretive and actually gets nervous if he's out in the open too long. Thus, places with dark passageways and shadowy interiors are particularly attractive. And so the time flew. Timid one moment, bold the next, each trying to outdo the other in feats of mouse-like skill and daring. Fun was fun, all right, but sometimes it's well to remember where you are and who you are and come down to earth. Suddenly they heard a sound. The heavy tread of footsteps outside. Somebody was coming. The moment they stepped in the door, the humans could sense something wrong. Father began to get a clue to the mystery when he found the mousetrap out of position and neatly sprung. Then he noticed the telltale tracks all over the desk. Somebody or something had been in the ink bottle, and somebody signed Mother's letter to Aunt Ethel with their feet. Dear Ethel, words fail me in describing the wonders of this place. And it might have been added, the interesting tracks of the little animals. And so it was that two little creatures of the wild had the narrow escape of their lives. Once back in their own domain, it was high time for the mice to be more careful. For now, they were up against enemies a lot more clever than mere fumbling humans. One of these was the weasel, the bane of every mouse's existence. The weasel was a hunter-killer, more dangerous for his size even than the mountain lion. And the very strain of keeping an eye on him was enough to put any rodent off balance. The weasel was lightning fast with quick reflexes and amazing reactions. The wise mouse, therefore, did well to keep out of his reach, which at times was considerable. Unlike most predators, the weasel never left off his hunting, but killed even when he was not hungry, merely for the sport of it. He didn't know what fear was. He would take on anything, anything that moved. Being non-poisonous, the gopher snake had but one chance, the chance that it could capture greased lightning in its coils. Finally, the weasel made his move for the head. And almost simultaneously, the reptile made its counter move, the stranglehold. Now the weasel was in trouble. Then he managed to break away, just long enough to catch his breath and back to the battle. But now the snake was trying a new strategy. It would play dead, and maybe this fiendish little fellow would go away. The trick almost worked, but not quite. Once the weasel got his bloodlust up, he didn't know when to stop. At last, the snake chose retreat. But this wasn't what the weasel wanted at all. The infuriated little animal tried its best to hold the reptile to its responsibilities. What kind of an opponent was this who would run from a fair fight? All morning long and well into the afternoon, the mountain lion had made her rounds, patient and with stealth, but without luck. On padded feet, she slipped across the bare stretches of granite, making no sound, yet seeing no potential prey. This was the way on Beetle Rock. Often as not, it was the predator who knew disappointment, who at day's end went hungry. Then her pace quickened. Something had caught her eye. Now her long hunting had purpose at last. That something was the herd buck. The buck was occupied with sharpening his antlers for the rutting battles he knew must come. And at this moment, his customary vigilance was not what it might have been. The cougar saw her chance. The herd buck, however, was not to be taken by surprise after all. Battle-wise and wary, he did not panic, but turned away seemingly unconcerned, for he knew a trick or two of this game himself. Quite on purpose, the buck picked out a cul-de-sac in the rocks and put good granite at his back. There was strategy behind his plan and long experience. This maneuver would make the cougar come to him, head on into his sharp and waiting antlers. From the storm king above, the rumble of distant thunder announced the herd buck's victory. Now the animals of these woods and meadows knew that a time of truce had come. All hunting must cease and all killing. The thunder said so. For this was the voice of the storm that came nearly every afternoon to this high country. To the creatures of Beetle Rock, the echoing sound and fury meant but one thing: rain. The coming of the rain meant that all game trails were wiped out and all tracks erased. And all preying on each other must come to a moment of pause while nature cleansed her mountain. Now was the time to seek shelter if shelter could be found, and if not, to weather the storm as best one could. The fury of the storm was soon spent, ceasing almost as suddenly as it came. As the afternoon wore on, the herd buck again took charge of his clan and led them towards the night's bedding ground. His was the vigil that knew no end. There came to Beetle Rock a moment of calm serenity, broken only by the calling of the hungry coyote. Some would listen, and some would sleep, and some would stand guard in the night as the long day came to its natural close.